All right, Olav, welcome to the Upside Strength podcast. How are you doing today?
Thank you. So, good, I would say. Breathing thin air at 2,650 meters.
Okay, where are you now?
Actually, I'm in Morocco, looking at a new high altitude facility leading into Paris 2024. So we are now in a planning process where we're going through everything from training strategies to locations we want to use and so on. So it's a busy month.
What makes a good altitude location for you?
Ideally, a little bit lower than 2,650 meters, I would say, for triathlon. But of course, I'm willing to see if we are able to, or as early as possible now, before we start to dial in where we want to be. I'm willing to see now if we are able to make adjustment to the program and get even better effect from going a little bit higher up to altitude. We know that it will require a little bit longer adaptation, so it will make changes to the overall program, both the specificity but also how we put things together. But we know that we have extremely good effect from altitudes between 1,800 and 2,300 meters already.
Are there other sports where you wouldn't be as maybe worried or concerned about going to higher altitude, or is it just because it's new and so you have to assess what impact it's going to have on the overall process that you're not sure about the 2,600 meters, a little bit higher altitude?
For me, I think if you just start from scratch, you can probably work on. There are several factors to consider, of course, and it also depends on how much time can you spend at altitude before before the competitions, between the competition, and so on, and that would dictate a little bit what kind of altitude I think would be optimal. I think there is a limit for triathlon with the schedule they have with the VTCS season, 8 races. Maybe you have to do some other races as well, depending on your ranking. But with 8 races and most of them packed within 6 months, it gives, of course, some constraints to the altitude, and that's why, for example, early in the season we go a little bit higher, then in the mid-season we go a little bit lower, and that is exactly because it allows us to spend less time for adaptation and more time to work on specificity between the races.
So I heard you talk about one of the main adaptations that you're seeking at altitude, which is increase hemoglobin mass. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then that obviously in turn increases how much oxygen you can transport. Are there other main adaptations that you're looking for in those altitude camps beside hemoglobin mass per se?
Yes, so I think that a little bit also how we periodicize the program too. So, for example, if you have a program that has a higher impact, let's say structural impact in parts of the period and less in, then altitude training also can be used as a way to block periodicize also how you basically do the pure force impact on the body. Going to altitude, what normally happens is that you will still have the same, or let's say for the same metabolic demand, what will happen is also that the structural impact will actually go low or go down as a function of it, and that can be beneficial in period to also cause a variation there in how we build up. But the main reason for going to altitude is the hemoglobin mass.
Is there any other, would it be right to say that the longer the event or the longer the sport, the more benefits there will be to altitude training? Or do you see in your mind some much shorter duration sports that would also benefit from altitude training? Or do you think that every high level athlete should at some point in time spend time at altitude? What do you think on that?
So actually, I would maybe, perhaps, of course, there are, what's the right word? Two-faceted answer to this, because if you purely look at it from from a VO2 perspective, I would say that the shorter the duration is, the more important it becomes to have, of course, good oxygen transport. While the longer the event becomes, the less important, let's say, or the limitation necessarily the oxygen uptake and oxygen transport will be. So in that sense, you could maybe say that, for example, for kayaking or K1 kayaking, single scull, or for rowing and 1500 meter runners, 3000 meter runners and so on, for those I would say that, and even shorter too, there it's, of course, it's critical to have a high oxygen supply, because you're really racing at the limit of it too. So anything extra you can get there is positive. While the longer the duration becomes, the further away you are from, let's say, VO2 max as a single limitation, then there are other limitations also that you have to balance it between. So I would say that any sport will benefit for it. The problem with the shorter duration sports, obviously being at altitude, is that it will maybe require you to race further away from the, let's say, from the external load that is required in competition, and then you need to have you plan your program differently so that you are able to bring back in that specificity leading into competitions. So you can't, if you take a triathlon program and you impose it on a kayaker, it will probably not work. And the same way, if you made an optimal program for a kayaker or 1500 meter runner, and then you impose it on triathlon, it would probably not work either. So it depends a little bit on how everything you want to bring everything together.
Is there any negative effects that we might see from altitude training on athletes that are not necessarily the type of profile that you might see for, triathlon, long course triathlon, but for the shorter, more powerful sports? So if we think about muscle mass, strength training, what considerations do we need to have regarding altitude camps and altitude training when it comes to those other parameters that, again, are maybe less important for longer endurance event athletes, but maybe more important for the shorter ones?
So one, of course, this becomes very detailed, and I think there are still many things that we don't know good enough yet. Of course, we have ID or from empiri, but one could imagine that, for example, when you go to altitude for more power-based sport or velocity-based sports, that you lose maybe, or the worst case would be that you're losing maybe a little bit of recruitment or muscle mass and these kind of things, because you're not able to maintain the same stimulus for it as you would do when you can naturally go faster. But I think also that we know that when you put a program very well together, the loss in recruitment and muscle mass can be very well maintained for a good period with a good strategy too. So it's a difficult question to give an easy answer to.
That's fair enough. So Olav, we jump right into the training questions here with altitude. I want to zoom back a little bit and talk about you. What does a typical week look like for you? Is there even a typical week? And if so, what does it look like? How do you organize your time?
No, there is no typical weeks, that's for sure. I think there, of course, some weeks repeat itself a little bit depending on where I am. Of course, when I am with the team, then it's very much being hands-on in the field, making measurements, having conversations, spending time with the athletes to optimize and make sure that when I leave from there, they are left with a very good understanding for the instruction purposes and everything that we want to achieve and how we do that, and anchor that in feelings and other things. When I am away, then it's more following up. Of course, we do Teams calls, just sitting and talking together, as well as depending on when it is, going through adjustments in the program based on the feedback from the athletes, and so and of course following, just looking at the data and just looking at what happens there, looking at the trends. But then also when I'm home, then maybe I'm working more on other projects as well, which everything is from where we are building or advancing now the field of call it making it sense out of data with the software that we are developing. To preparing what's coming next. For example, now I'm away from the athletes. I'm now in. I've been now in Morocco to assess the location here. But also we are working on this project. We are working on the program and strategy leading all the way into Paris 2024. So more the macro perspective of it. What changes do we want to make from Tokyo to Paris? We don't. I'm not a believer in that we can copy what we did leading into Tokyo. I think that's good enough for Paris 2024 because there will be the whole dynamics of all the Olympic racing changes. And then of course I have a family that means everything to me, that I try of course to spend time with as much as possible, especially when I'm home. But it's we are working on research articles, so a lot of the things that we did into Tokyo we will be publishing over the next years. And of course we are doing new research projects as well, planning some new research projects, some more crazy, some more building on what we have been doing. So, and then of course I'm involved in several technology companies also to advance the possibility to do more in vivo research also in, or let's say in the natural habitats of the athletes with minimal invasiveness. So there are a few boring days.
Definitely.
I could probably actually appreciate a few more boring days to be honest.
What does Olav do on a boring day? What's your ideal boring day?
Actually, if I remember my mother, she taught me when I was a kid that of course then you're running all over the place and you want to have fun most of the time. But there were times where I wanted to do things and my mother said, no, that's not going to happen. And I said, of course, I don't remember exactly the dialogue, but it's more the words. And that was that we, as siblings or individuals, had actually to learn to be bored and find actually pleasure in being bored. So actually a boring day for me, and the days that I actually miss sometimes, is the ability to just go deep into nature, being actually completely, paradoxically enough, or ironically, separated completely from technology and actually just take in nature. For me, that's a really good way of recharging my batteries. So a boring day for me would be actually just get into nature and just take it in. I could go. I remember good memory. I have a lot of good memories from the expedition where I did, and just put up the tent in the middle of the winter. There's basically just vast plains of snow, putting on the stove, making a meal, and you're just sitting there taking in the wind and the silence and everything. So that would be a boring day, but maybe a day that makes more for my health than anything else.
How do you rationalize that? How do you explain it? The fact that going out in nature, spending time, like you said, away from all this technology that we live with every day and we work with as well, depending on our situation. Why is it so beneficial / important to go out and spend time in the wilds without necessarily any of those ties that we're always attached to?
I think that we are losing a little bit touch with ourselves because we are so occupied with driving things forward. Like for myself, for example, I always have this drive just to see how far can we really push things, how far can we really dig into things and understand things, not on a molecular level, but even on atomic level and what's beyond, and that, or even going the other way on a really huge level, like for example energetic level or even beyond. But when we get so obsessed over these things, and we this is something that pushes us all the time. One, I think that sometimes it's easy to lose a little bit perspective of what's important in life, And I think also that we are losing a little bit touch with ourselves sometimes, what really is important, and being able to listen to our own body. That is also maybe a trait that is really not prioritized enough for anybody today. I don't know if, of course, getting a little bit philosophical here, but of course, it is a little bit of a concern that you hear that more and more people are getting psychological and physiological problems. And then if you start to philosophize or dig a little bit into it, what's the cause behind it? Then I think that much of it is solved by actually spending a little bit of time with yourself and actually daring to maybe get in touch with your own mind, but also actually being out and actually exercising and just doing what we are made to do from nature's side.
That leads nicely into my next question. I wanted to talk about how you learn, how you process, or what your process is for seeking out, understanding, and integrating new information. And maybe we can, flip that and talk about I guess the second part first, which is the integration part, which for me at least requires myself to try to detach myself from everything that I'm reading. And again, like you just said, spend time alone and try to reflect and try to integrate, synthesize. Do you have a given process for that before we talk about how you seek out new information? Once you've sought it out, once you've found it, what's your process to try and integrate it into your current understanding, your current model?
So I think, of course, I think very often we all are looking for the easy answer to do something. We want to know how can we be equally fit as Kristian and Gustav with just doing some simple tricks, or how can we be the smartest person in a domain, or whatever it is. But I think that the beauty is, of course, that we are different. We are all different when we all have our different drives and inspirations. And of course, that maybe we are able to understand someday how we can trigger different inspirations or desires to really dig into something and find a drive that allows us to go into whatever domain that we are interested in. I think maybe what have brought me there is that one, I grew up on a farm, and where I had to take part in a lot of the chores that was at home, against my own, how to say,
will.
No, well, will is one thing, but let's say desire at least. But I think that gave me some really good strengths later in life, like discipline and putting in a lot of work. But I think also that I probably had a lot of curiosity that I was allowed to explore at least to a fairly big strength without being constrained when I was a kid. And I think that with this curiosity, it was not only limited to one specific domain. I was very curious about a lot of things. And I think that range today, I very often see that because I come from a technology background, engineering technology background, then I had a life-changing moment in 2011 where I lost parts of my family, and I was running up on I had to run up on a mountain hill to be able to get out and call for emergency, and this took me almost an hour to get up there. So eventually, of course, I got some time to think about my limitation. At that time I was very strong. I had a lot of power because I did sailing, and what most people don't actually think about is that sailing is an extremely explosive sport. So if we use the words or the definition correctly, explosive, velocity, endurance, and so on, sailing is an explosive sport, very much in the same way that you actually go in and you do powerlifting, because you're sitting completely still on the boat, and within a couple of seconds, everything just explodes on the boat when you're going to attack or a jibe, and then basically everything is calm again. So all the tasks have to happen with an extremely high power or velocity on the boat. But I got a lot of time to think when I run up on a mountain hill, strangely enough, that I had to do something with my endurance, my conditioning. I grew up just outside of where Norseman triathlon is. So first thing that came to my mind, what is extreme and what is endurance? Well, that's triathlon. We have Norseman in Eidfjord. And then I think I always been good at finding people that I really think are the best people in their domain in the world. So I met with Dr. Ørjan Madsen, which was one of the people responsible for building up the Olympic Federation in Norway, and asked him to coach me. He did kiting at that time, I did kiting at that time, and it was a good match. And he eventually privately tutored me in physiology, and then to merge the domain of technology and physiology. So, but of course, I've done a lot of other things as well, very often following my passions. And I think that when I follow the passions in the different domains, I see very often today that I'm drawing parallels between things, and that allows me sometimes to ask questions, and that leads me to starting to do research. And I have a lot of smart people around me that I can then engage in discussions with, and we can use. You have more like the maybe first a little bit the philosophical approach, and then you get a little bit more the concrete approach, and then eventually that leads into doing research. And of course, I would not be able to do all these things unless I had all these people around me, which is nothing short of extraordinary. And that I think it's probably a good combination of coincidence that I just had a lot of good people around me in this domain, and that's the reason why I do sports today. But it could easily well have been another domain if that was the people around, and let's say then my background and curiosity. So there is how I seek out information is, I think, one, the range that I have just from my background, or variety from my background in different domains. And then of course the people that I have around me that allow me to excel much faster than if I had to look through all the books I could find to finally find information that could potentially lead me to do something. And also I think it's important that I never, when I find a research study that I find very interesting, I never say that, okay, then we're going to do this. I rather say, okay, this is interesting, but we have to reproduce this. So we reproduce always the studies that I find interesting. We always reproduce this, because very often research is done in vitro or in lab environments that are outside or out of the context that we are trying to excel in. And they, of course, in order for a study to be valid, you have to remove a lot of noise too. But in the daily life, noise is a part of the package. But I think it is just this curiosity and this passion for what I call peak human performance that just continuously drives me to figure out, can we find out something new? And then when we have good results, that's really nice, but that is more a bonus than all the excitement and joy we are having together as a team, being able to dig deeper into different stuff.
Do you consider that to extend to the broader world of sports performance? And is that one of the reasons that you share openly the vast majority of the practices that you've put in place, is because it's through that sharing, that act of sharing, let's say, that you can also gain information from other people or gain insight into their perspectives and maybe some of the limitations that you might not see in your approach?
Yeah, exactly. I think two things actually to that. The reason why we are very open about what we are doing and so on, and I really share is one, that of course there are many. If I had more time, I would like to dig even deeper into it. But when you share, some people will pick it up that are smarter than me in that domain, and they will advance it, and then I can learn from that again. But my benefit is that I can bring that together with all the other things in other domains as well. And the other things of it, which I'm also actually always motivating my athletes also to do, and that is that when we share our competitive advantages or share about that, we are putting ourselves out of the comfort zone, and that also again creates a drive that you know, oh, now I shared something, now people will catch up with me, so I have to find some new competitive advantage now, because it's easy to grow. Maybe a little bit too comfortable with your competitive advantage, and at some point people will catch up and they will exceed you because they see something new, and they know that to be better than you, they have to do the same plus some more.
As you've illustrated really well up until now, you have a huge personal investment in the project with Gustav and Kristian, with your other athletes as well. What advice would you give to a coach or a young coach who, you know, strives to become just the best coach that he or her can be, what are the behaviors that they need to implement? What are the practices that we need to be thinking about in order to get there on the side of, you know, being personally invested in what we do as coaches?
I think it depends a little bit, because I would maybe differentiate into two groups, and that is the group with coaches and athletes that can spend time together, or where the setup is that allows them to spend time together, either virtually or preferably physically. And then you have the other group which are mainly working remotely, and that would probably drive a little bit two different concepts. I think always spending time together as a team is superior, because in the end it boils very much down to the chemistry and being a part of something together. I don't consider myself, for example, with Kristian and Gustav, I don't consider myself as the boss or the one that knows everything and gonna just say that, okay, this is what you're gonna do, but rather where I learn equally much for them, because when we make a change, they can feel it on their body. They also have other thoughts and reflection. They are incredibly smart athletes. And then they can give me information back that I'm not able to quantify with sensors and other things. And it can only be quantified through dialogue and perceiving them in the action there. So that, again, of course, allows me to, again, ask maybe better questions than if I was not present, because I wouldn't be able to observe it, or I wouldn't have that kind of feedback. I think also one thing that is a danger today is that it's very easy to get to get caught by the hype of everything from instruments to supplements and all kinds of quick fixes to problems. But in reality, it doesn't work that way, never. I think instruments are good things, but you have to know, you can either approach it inductively or deductively. So for example, one way is that you just instrument somebody up with a lot of instruments. You just say that these instruments, they're just going to run in the background. I'm going to focus on my coaching from a natural, seeing my athletes, and then basically see and listen to them, what they respond to, these kind of things. And then you start to look for patterns, repeating patterns or trends in the data. And then when you start to do this, then this would allow you maybe to become smarter in your programming or bring it to the next step. The other way would be, of course, that you bring in, and I think this is probably the best always to have a balance between the two. But I think very often also, if we do too much at the same, or just induce too much things at the same time, you'll have poor quality or mediocre quality on a lot of things and not really excel in anything. And that is also, of course, a danger, because we are all looking, whether you are an athlete that's 3 hours a week or 30 hours a week for training, we are looking to maximize the return of invested time, independently of how much time we got available. Whether, even if it's just for looking for health benefit, you're looking to how can I maximize my health benefit from the least amount of time, or let's say for the time that I have available to invest, and make it enjoyable too. So my advice would always be to try the human dialogue. I think you can't separate physiology and psychology. They are two the same thing, basically. The brain is fighting for the exact same resources as your muscles are. They are both running from carbohydrates, and they both need oxygen. So basically, if your muscles are using more oxygen and more carbohydrates, it means basically that you don't have an infinitive amount of that in your body. So it is a distribution between the two. Of course, you would, in some cases, you can have maybe injuries, or you can have things that happens that, of course, where you need to separate the two. But in normal, let's say in a healthy environment where things are where the person is healthy, then they are the same. And I think that in those contexts, you will always learn the most from developing together with the athletes. I do know there are some athletes that just want to have instructions. They just want to know what do I do? What should I do? But still, I think the advice would always be that don't obsess over data, obsess over the athlete, and then rather bring in the data to try to get a better understanding of what is going on.
One thing that I would have had a very hard time doing with that advice a few years ago when I started coaching was the idea that as a coach, I have to ask questions to the athlete, because that actually puts me it doesn't anymore. I hope I've learned a few things over the years, but now, like you said, one of my main line of work is asking questions, because getting the feedback helps me do my job better. But as a young coach, you maybe don't have the confidence that you have later on in your career, and asking questions to an athlete means you don't know everything, and that might give the perception, or that's really just what you perceive of yourself as, oh, but that's not who I want to be. I want to be the coach that knows and that can help. So what would you say to that?
No, I perfectly agree. It's I think being open about what we are trying to achieve together, and saying that in the same way that you are not you are not the Olympic athlete today, I'm not the Olympic coach today either. So we have to have a project here that we believe in together, and then we have to develop together. So that means in the same way that we are trying to make you faster, I'm also trying to get smarter. But as you get faster and I get smarter, that's a really nice or good reinforcement loop that makes it just faster and faster. So you have to grow together. I think even if you I think even for me or for yourself, we won't be able to work with everybody in the world, because in the end it's also about the chemistry between two persons, and it doesn't help if I come in and bring in all kinds of well, this is what we did, and so on and so on and so on. If the athlete doesn't believe in it, or there is not they are not able to understand it, or they are not there's not a chemistry between the two, then it's just a waste of both persons energy, and in many cases you would maybe even be better off just using somebody that are able to see you, that really have not even coached at a high level, but are able to see you, they are open, and they want to basically develop together with you. So absolutely, I think being open and about it. We don't know all, and there is nobody in the world that knows all, and it is a project in together making the person that we work together better both ways.
So it's the word that comes to mind is collaboration, right? It's a collaboration between the coach, the team, and the athlete or the athletes, and everybody works, like you said, together as a unit. It's not somebody dictating something to someone, even though, like you said, maybe some people think it might have to be that way. But I feel like, oh, we'll talk about perception after, because that was one of the topics I wanted to talk about. Before we go there, another question that I had was regarding athletic potential or athlete peak potential. So maybe give us a brief overview of your perspective on genetic potential and the differences between different individuals. Is everybody equal in that regard? Are some people genetically predisposed to certain performances in certain sports? And then I want to talk about something as a continuation of that train of thought. So let's talk genetics first. What's your standpoint on genetic potential, if we may call it that?
So I think what is quite interesting in my group is that the athletes are very different. If you look at it just from a visual from just, I would say, just looking at them, they are very, very different builds on them. And I think that the reason for why they are, Kristian wins one race, Gustav another race, is because there is no one size fits all. You have to learn the athletes. The funny thing is actually that it's not only on a physiological level, but also on a psychological level. And it's very, myself, I have to sometimes take myself in wanting to say that, well, how, if I think that we have to do a little bit more like this in order to beat, so for example, Gustav, that maybe look at Kristian, he is doing these kind of things. How don't you think that we have to do a little bit more like that? But the thing is that I basically see that they are so different, both psychologically and physiologically, and how they basically have to arrange their days, that in order to get out the maximum potential. And that is, of course, what makes it really interesting. But of course, it's also extremely time consuming to go down to the level in both domains. So genetic potential, I this is of course an always returning topic. How much is genetic, how much is environment, and these kind of things. And I am inclined to think that with individualization and the correct stimulus, and also the fact that we see that we have the potential to change our genetics even within our own lifetime, and we are talking about epigenetics, then I see that the body also is so incredible to compensate for different demands with a good stimulus. That, for example, if you look at VO2 max, and to give you the listeners a very one thing, that is, VO2 max is something that we have been obsessing over for decades, millennia, probably soon. If you look at Kristian, a lot of people look at his chest and see, okay, he has an advantage. He has a huge chest, so a lot more air that comes in. The interesting thing is that when I bring them into the lab, yes, Kristian has a significantly higher ventilation than what Gustav has. But ventilation is not what makes you faster. It is the oxygen uptake that makes you faster. And the oxygen uptake of the two athletes are virtually the same. It's insignificant differences. So how can this be? Well, we look at something physical and we anchor it in ventilation or something that seems like very, but if you look at extraction of oxygen from the volume, Gustav has a far better extraction from the volume air that he has available than what Kristian has. So you just see that the body is so incredible to compensate for different, for different, let's say, lacks or potentials that it has, that it leads me, and this is only one example, I have a lot of examples of this, and that leads me to believe that if you just do the individualization good enough, and that of course is the hard task, because that's not the easy answer that people are looking for. It's a lot of work. It's a research study almost on each different athlete if you want to be the best. But it basically leads me to believe that maybe genetics has an extremely small impact. You can maybe say that maybe everybody cannot be the best triathlete in the world, but I am sure that the same athlete or the same person, if you're just finding that sport or that activity for that person, even if you're an outlier genetically, you'll find where they can really exceed to peak human performance. And maybe if you're just crazy enough, maybe even in triathlon even, but it just requires a more untraditional approach to it. And we have to remember also that what is traditional today have also been untraditional at a point before. And I'm sure that we will get these new paradigm shifts, because there are many times also that we are discussing that where we just said, okay, what do we do now? This is already outside whatever has been documented in literature before. So we are in uncharted territory, and we don't know when things gonna break. When will things break? And okay, so how do we try to make the next step, but with the least possible risk of something breaking? But it is pushing boundaries, and at the same time pushing boundaries, also trying to understand and see if we can make something different. And I'm sure that we haven't seen peak human performance, even though people have written articles on it and said that peak human, or whatever the highest oxygen uptake you can have is this, for example, or this based on genetics and so on. I'm sure that this also will change over the next decade.
Now, if we go to the follow-up question that I had on this, what is your perspective on personality traits? Is there a certain personality profile that is necessary in an athlete if they want to exploit that potential and become the best at their discipline? Can anybody, if let's take two people that have, like you said, a similar genetic potential, in that we can train them with the right stimulus up to a very, very high level, do you see certain personality traits in the athletes that you work with that you would consider to be prerequisites in order to succeed at being the best at a sport in the world? Or can, again, from that perspective, can anybody do it potentially?
Again, they're very good, because this is actually exactly back to the same thing as genetics. Again, looking at Kristian, Gustav, and other athletes, they are very, very different. And that's also the interesting thing here, is that I see that they are also very different psychologically too. So that also leads me to think that no, there is no one specific personal traits that you need, but you can't think yourself to have big muscles or a big VO2 max or something. You have to do the job, and actually the body have to adapt to this. And as the body adapts to this, of course, you get a positive reinforcement that you see that you're adapting, you are getting faster. I think the same thing is with psychology as well. Psychology, again, you can make it in very, or simplified, you can think of it in the same way there. You can't think yourself to become a winner in the Olympics or whatever race. I think you need also to go to a true adaptations there. And I think that those are very often overlooked because we very often obsess over physiology and these kind of things, and we forget a little bit about it. It doesn't help if you have even the best, let's call it genetic potential, physiological potential, and you've been trained to have a VO2 max that nobody have ever seen before. You have an utilization which is astronomical if you don't believe in yourself in a race. Because also, depending a little bit on the race that you are, you also sometimes have to set up the race a little bit to your advantage, and to be actually confident enough to set up a race a little bit to your advantage when you're riding in a group or other things. They're taking the lead, believing, okay, this is going to be tougher than what I've done before, but okay, I got it in me. Getting to that point, that is also a step or a process that needs to be developed in humans, whether it's sports, business, whatever. Believing in yourself that you actually have what it takes to be the best. And I'm actually very happy that there is no single answer to it, because I really like to believe that we are all equal and we all can be the best, but we need to listen to our body. We need to be in an environment where we are that triggers this, and we have the desire to do something about it. And I think it's also very respectable to just say that, well, I don't have ambitions, I don't have a desire to be the best. I'm actually happy with where I am, because not everybody can be the best in the world either. And you can also be the best in the world with not having ambitions too. And I think that is very often an undervalued trait in humanity, that we think that everybody has to be high performance seekers, measured in either in medals or money or whatever it is. I think it is important also that there are many other traits which is very often overlooked, which is also. So I like to think, and I have pretty good indications of it still, that the group that I'm working with, of course, it's not a huge group, but they are very different, both physiologically and psychologically, which basically tells me that with the right people in the group, with the right chemistry, you can basically develop anybody to reach their peak human potential.
Stealing a line from Niels van der Poel's training manual, if I remember it correctly, he was talking about the importance of the language that the coach uses to encourage or to communicate with the athlete. And he was saying, especially in hard moments, what he needed was, you're doing great, and not push harder, because he couldn't push harder. So psychologically, in the hardest of moments, you want to hear that you're doing great, because you're more likely to continue on that. Is there any other things that come to your mind when I say this, in regards to how we coaches can talk to our athletes in order to get the best out of them?
I think this is also a place where one have to be very open about that. We have the same intention. We have the same intention of bringing forward the best in both of us. And that means also that communication is not something that will be brilliant from day one. It's something that also have to be developed. And we are going to make errors. We're going to make errors in training on the physiological part. We're going to make errors in that we, in the heat of the moment, we maybe choose the wrong words that maybe the athlete perceives wrong, or that's not what the athlete wants to hear at the moment, because we say you are doing great, while the athlete know, this is not great. This is just stupid words from the coach, and then I think it's important afterwards to sit down and talk about it, because if this happens too often, that the dialogue between the coach or what the coach is saying and what actually the athlete is feeling, there are too big discrepancy between the two. You might end up actually growing apart from each other in the dialogue. So that's why I think it's also important to, again, the best thing you want to be is that when you are in an environment where you are, I think, comfort of being respect and allowing to be open about what you feel without being slaughtered for it, but actually being hurt for it, because nobody can take away your feeling. What you feel is what you feel. Nobody can say that that's wrong. This is the feeling the athlete have, or this is the feeling the coach have. The coach can also be hurt because the athlete yells at the coach because they are frustrated because they're not able to do something. And of course, the coach can be hurt. But I think then it's important to talk about this and say that, okay, this is, so that the athlete can say, okay, I'm sorry, it was in the heat of the moment. Of course, I had no intention of hurting you, but in that I had all my muscles were using all my oxygen and my carbohydrates. My brains are not thinking straight. So I think being open also about the dialogue and developing it and is equally important as developing, again, in the same way that you are developing velocity, you have to develop dialogue too. It's a process of trial and error.
Another area where I think that might fit in is one thing that you mentioned. I believe it was the conclusion that you gave at the Moxie Summit this year, but I might have heard it somewhere else as well. The idea of going back to perception, right? What people perceive, what we feel, the idea of fine-tuning perception using technology, kind of merging the two elements that we've been talking about since the beginning of the podcast here. So how can we best go about doing this? How can we best leverage technology in order to get better at feeling or be more accurate at figuring out what is going on inside our body? And then secondly, what are some of the pitfalls that we need to avoid in doing so?
So I think that one thing that maybe Gustav have phrased well, and I'm going to quote him on, and that is that with the instruments, it allows us to understand with a greater precision what is going on in the body. Because again, when you are exercising, you are using carbohydrates, you're using oxygen and so on. It means less available for your brain. So you could imagine maybe that then also there's less ability to really perceive yourself also objectively or in a good way. And in those senses, is maybe it's hard to know whether is it safe now to push further. Should I push further? And then with objective instruments, you are able maybe to quantify and maybe at least make a more informed decision on whether we think it is smart or whether it is wise to try to push a little bit harder than if you don't have access to it. So again, I think that instrument will never give you the answer. They are just there to give you a higher resolution and and potentially a better understanding that allows for more informed decisions, but well knowing that you might also fail. But I think technology definitively have the potential to drive together with subjective, the subjective, or let's call it the qualitative feedback from the athlete, and then with instruments, I cannot believe that we would be able to do it better without technology and instrument. But they have to go hand in hand, and they are not absolute tools. They are tools that allows you to basically think of it this way. Instruments, when you are always trying to push further, it is a research product because you are not there. You don't know necessarily how to go there. You're trying to do it better and understand it better. And then basically these are just research instruments trying to help you answer, or not answer, but getting a deeper understanding of what you are doing. Well knowing also that there are a lot of instruments that we don't have yet that we can use. So be aware that there are information that we don't know, and you have to have that in the back of your mind when you are also looking into the data and looking and trying to move things forward.
On that front of trying to enhance our perception using technological tools that we have access to, from your perspective, what are currently the most useful and practical tools that one could use in order to do that, in order to get better at merging the two together and enhancing our perception of what we're doing in the moment during an effort?
If So then we're not talking about the qualitative feedback loop, because if I only had to rely on one feedback loop, I would get rid of all the instrument and just listen to the athlete, obviously.
Exactly.
But if we're talking about technology now, I think there are different layers of let's say instrument, and I think we have one thing that we very often this is even they fail on in research projects, even in great research projects, they even fail on this, and that is to differ between concentration metrics and volumetric metrics.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very, sometimes I hear that, for example, now when I'm up here at altitude, I know people go to the doctor, they do they check their hemoglobin concentration, and they check their hematocrit, and they look at, oh, fantastic, the altitude stay was fantastic. But we know that that does not work at all. And the reason why it doesn't work is because that one of the first things that happens when you go to altitude is, one, the air is drier, it's colder and it's drier. And the second thing also is that your ventilation increases because there are less oxygen per liter of air that you're breathing. So when you do this now, basically what happens is that you're naturally starting to dehydrate a little bit. And when you are dehydrating, what happens is that basically your hemoglobin concentration goes up and your hematocrit goes up. So now already you will just say that, well, fantastic, then I can even replace altitude training with just getting dehydrated, and it will be wonderful. But the problem is that it's the thing that actually transports oxygen around in the body, and like you say, the ability to transport more oxygen around in the body means basically that we have to increase the hemoglobin mass. So that means that basically for every gram extra of hemoglobin we are getting, we can transport approximately 1.34 milliliter extra of oxygen with that gram. But the only way to know that is that then you need to do a volumetric measurement, meaning that you, in this sense, you need to put in tracer gases, and then you have to look at the change as a function of this. And that goes for a lot of other things as well, that we very often look at concentration metrics. For example, lactate, for example, that's a concentration metric. Again, hydration will affect your lactate concentration, for example. So if you are trying to target a specific number because you have heard this is maybe a good idea, then already you will make fairly big errors there too. Heart rate is a concentration metric, it's not a volumetric. The only volumetric measurements we have today is time velocity, time power, and time metabolics. Basically, there's the only volumetric measurements we are. But we can think of it also in the way that basically if you look at metabolics and time, that's the furthest away from performance, because there are many things happening before that. It's in the same way as a car. The engine is basically, you can think of that, or the fuel and the engine is basically the metabolics, more or less, or let's call it the fuel. And then you have the power, which is maybe the engine. But in reality, it doesn't matter if you have a very poor efficiency on your engine and you have a very poor transmission from the engine back to the back wheels, back out to the wheels where it really matters to move the car forward. Then you are making a lot of assumptions. So if I would say that there's one single metric which is the most important one you can, and then of course now you have to put it into a system, because as a runner you're not going to always run flat. There will be other things that are affecting, like wind, gradients, and these kind of things. But at least if you want to have one, then I would say that a clock and distance and accurate distance are the two most important metrics that you have available to assess whether something is working or not working. So when you maybe then make a standardized workout, for example, as a benchmark workout that you repeat at a certain pattern in your program, you're looking basically, okay, have the intervention that we did now over the previous period or even over the last week, are we able to bring that into a slightly better performance now, this week, or compared to previous weeks? And if you see that, of course, then you know that you are doing something correct. But what you have been doing correct, of course, that's where you can now start to add the next layers of instruments to try to understand what really did change now to make this better. But we can also think of it the other way, that is not needed before it is needed. So as long as you basically see there's a progress, then you know that, okay, fine, we are on the track. And when things stagnate, that doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong, but you can already just from time and velocity itself. And if you now do assessment at different velocities, and durations, you also now get a profile of the athlete, and you can see whether how is basically the curve of this changing now. Is it increasing in the short domain, or in the longer domain? And what is it that you really try to achieve? If you really want to excel in the longer domain, but you see that it's stagnating there now, but it's developing the shorter domain, that means that, well, for the hours that are available now, let's try to redistribute a little bit. So we are bringing down a little bit now the volume that you are spending on, for example, the shorter domain, and then bring it over to the longer domain. So there you can. It is basically just the imagination that sets a limit to what you can do with even extremely simple instruments like time and just a stopwatch and a distance. Because if you just put the right protocol and method together there, you can already there get a fairly good understanding of what really is happening and how the athlete and the individual athletes are responding to one program. To two athletes, same program, only with a stopwatch, you can basically see that, okay, with the same program now, we see that these athletes are progressing more in the short duration domain compared to the longer, and the other athlete, and that already there can inform you that you need to start to do an individualization there. So only the imagination that basically has a limit to the creativity, to how we can use even the simplest instruments in developing athletes.
We had a good question on Twitter from Gordo Byrne, who asked, what are the most important work metrics to track for a triathlete? And does your answer here match well with this? You would look at essentially a power duration or a time duration relationship on the different distances, or would you go further and say that for competitive triathletes there might be other things that we need to be tracking that are as important or more important?
No, velocity duration, power duration are the two single most important, and I would say that velocity duration even more important than power duration, because you can even standardize for biking, and of course there you can say there are more noise because of aerodynamics and these kind of things that also are influencing it. But you can have two athletes, both athletes same weight, but one are producing much more power than the other athlete. It doesn't make him faster unless he is more aerodynamic, or that he's equally aerodynamic, or more aerodynamic. So again, velocity duration is in the end what matters. So that would be the single most important thing to track for the athletes, and then use the creativity and the way to really implement it there. And it's also maybe the simplest way to avoid that you are getting into the pitfalls of over analyzing data that really doesn't give you the data that you are looking for. But I think that what is good when you are introducing other metrics to or other instruments as well is that it allows you to do an accounting of what is happening almost in real time with the athlete as they adapt to something, and makes it possible to make quicker adjustments in your program as you go, compared to if you only have like a standardized workout each week, or even worse, the benchmark happens in the competition, because then you're just blindly trusting that the program you have is working between the competitions, while you could have learned so incredibly much in between there by maybe introducing more instruments and trying to understand what is really changing in the body now as you're prescribing the workouts, and then see that, okay, you are basically responding much quicker to this than what we actually thought. So we can but we think that this is also a characteristic that we need to develop also in the program. So we can bring already the volume here now a little bit on this and redistribute it a little bit more to this domain instead. So the instrument allows you, of course, to do on, let's call it, if you were running a business, it would be very bad to only keep a track of your accounts once a year. You wouldn't know whether you were bankrupt or you were becoming a millionaire. But if you track your money flow during or very often, it would allow you to better understand your business and where do you earn money, where do you not earn money, and maybe distribute it better so that you would be able to earn leverage the areas where you could, or you basically see that you may have to spend money on some areas because they're strategic for the areas where you want to earn money. Same way with training, specificity alone will probably not make you the fastest. So you need to understand also what are the fundamentals that needs to be around specificity to allow you to go the fastest possible when it matters.
On that point, you often talk about the specific demands of the task and knowing what the demands of your sport are. So if you were to start coaching in a sport that you're not currently familiar with, what would be your approach to, or what would be your framework going into the analysis of the task and the demands of that sport?
So again, I think that this is independently whether it's sports or whether it's business, and that is that my approach to it would always be to go in and observe first, because there are many things that you have to take into account. It's very easy to obsess over some metrics, hard metrics, like for example, either it was in business, money, or in sports, faster or faster times. But really to understand what drives this or sets you up where you are, you need to understand what are the drivers behind this. So in business, of course, you need to understand the culture, what motivates people, and so on, so that you really understand the fundament and also the psychology behind why people want your product. And the same way also in sports, you need to understand what really motivates this workout, because you could say that, well, all research shows that this is the best workout that is to develop, for example, this kind of characteristic, but you basically see that the athlete is not able to motivate him to do that kind of workout. So now you have to be a little bit creative and understand how can you either motivate now the athlete to do this workout, or how can you make a new version of this workout that basically drives the same demand. If you just go in blindly and you just think that we have seen work and we have so much research on this, you're gonna fail. And that's why I think that good coaches, if you look at who are the best to develop the best athletes, they are very often, a big majority of them, being coaches and very often not having any physiological education at all. While when you bring in a physiologist, they very often have a more like a clinical approach to the training and these kind of things, and they actually don't have the understanding of the human, which is again what you're really trying to make better. But that means that you need to, for me, the approach is always to go in with a very open mind, understand what had brought this athlete to where he is today, what had been the coaching philosophy before, what really motivates these athletes, and in the past, what would they do typically in a situation where things were tough, when things just went on tracks. And then when you do this and you even instrument up these domains so that you can even understand it maybe on a deeper level than what had been done before, this is when you would start to change, make small changes. Again, if you are sick and you go to 3 doctors and they all have 3 different approaches to how to treat your sickness, how on earth do you know which of the method did work then? So you need to really understand what is that drives performance, both from a physiological and a psychological perspective. And then you have to see, then you make the gap analysis, where do you think there are the most to be gained, and you try now to change one thing at a time, potentially in the domains where you see there are most to be gained, without losing the other parts.
In elite triathlon at this very moment, where are the biggest gaps in your opinion that could be explored and exploited in order to increase performance overall?
So I think that and now I'm sharing very openly about one field that I am a very strong believer in. But I think that if you go into sport and you're trying to find, it's not an accurate predictor, but it's probably the statistically most significant predictor of performance. It's not VO2 max, it's not your threshold, it's actually sheer volume. If you plot performance on the x-axis and volume on the y-axis, the single best predictor of performance is volume. The athlete that trains 1 hour a week will never be, or will not never, I should never say never, because there are the outliers, and that's why I said it's not like this. You can, but basically, there, if you take an athlete that trains 1 hour compared to an athlete that trains 10 hours, I would find it hard to believe that you find a well-trained athlete that train. Of course, if you train completely wrong or something like this, surely. But if you say everything is sound here, if it was the same coach that, for example, coached them and they were the same, they had the same mindset, then I would say that the 5-hour athlete will always be slower than the 10-hour athlete, and or I'll put it all the way in more positive context. The 10-hour athlete will always be faster than the 5-hour athlete. The 15-hour athlete will always be faster than the 10-hour athlete. The 20-hour athlete will always be faster than the 15-hour athlete, and the 30-hour athlete will always be faster than the 20. So then the question is just, where's the limit? Where is the limit to this? So it is, but the problem when we are coming up to the volume we are now, and as you might know, is I spend a lot of energy on trying to become smarter in basically energy budgeting and energy tracking. And this, of course, this domain is either extremely invasive or extremely cost intensive. And we are working now with a company in Switzerland called GreenTag. They have the core sensor that a lot of people are using today, but there we are getting fairly close to direct calorimetry. Of course, it's not perfect because you are measuring on the outside of the body, there are kinetics involved, but it's now getting so close to indirect calorimetry that it's almost is scary that we can do this with this small sensor. That's for one. And of course, this is a field that has been studied for decades, the maximum sustainable energy expenditure, and we know there are variations to it, but statistically it's been basically said it's 2.5 times the resting metabolic rate. And of course, we know that even the resting metabolic rate is something that is not even for a single person static, it fluctuates. But we know that for my athletes, we are much higher than 2.5 times the resting metabolic rate. And this is very simple. If you only have 1 hour for training a week, you have to prioritize. So if that's going to be your VO2 max, that's your VO2 max, exaggerating a bit now. But then it's easy to understand that an athlete has 5 hours a week and he can do both the VO2 max session that the other athletes is doing. But at the same time, he can work on the fundament for the VO2 max. So he can do some threshold work and maybe can do some even higher intensity intervals that allows him to progress faster. So we can imagine that the more we have in budget now, the more we have, the more we can train, the faster we will be. Again, I think I'm gonna put my head on the table and say that it's the single best predictor of performance is the volume that you're putting in, whether you are Usain Bolt, even a sprinter. The difference would be that a sprinter that is spending 2 hours a week preparing for a sprint, and you have like Usain Bolt, I'm pretty sure you'll see the significant difference in the volume that they are doing even. So it is independent of the sport that you are doing. But the problem is the closer we get to the ceiling of this limit or whatever it must be, and we are already beyond the limits there, the precision that we have to employ and the willingness to pull back if you're a little bit uncertain, the moment you're uncertain, to be on the safe side. Because if you overtrain, or if you are exceeding this budget, a little bit too long, overtraining, which is on the psychological side and physiological side, is major, and it becomes chronic, and it's some of the last thing you really want to have for your athletes. And of course, you can have fractures because the body doesn't have enough energy to adapt to the workouts, because you have to remember that the workouts are really stressing the body and bring it down, and it's the rest period, the recovery periods that allows you to adapt and become stronger. So, and for that we need energy. Yeah, that is where are the limits? I have no clue yet. We are already at numbers that are crazy, so why don't see if we can become even more crazy and see if we can go even faster.
To further your point, I remember reading some information about the sport of weightlifting, which again has nothing to do with necessarily with the endurance sports, but to your point, one of the best predictors of competition performance was yearly tonnage. How much you lifted in the year has a very, very good, high impact on how much you were going to lift in competition. And I remember, as you said, reading that for endurance sports as well. Biathlon, if you look at the performances, they're tightly linked to how much volume you put in. And obviously, your guys are a testament to that as well. You talked about, 30-hour training weeks on average, with peaks at 35, 40. If we look at Niels van der Poel, that's essentially what he did as well, leading into his preparation. So there's definitely a pattern emerging there, and it's very interesting that, like you said, if you push the reasoning far enough, now it's not about volume, it's about the fuel to be able to tolerate and assimilate the volume, which I imagine is a very interesting field now that we're getting to the point where people can train that much because of all the infrastructure that is around it. Do you see that as being the kind of the next frontier in peak human performance?
So everything, of course, starts with calories. I said it a couple of times before. There is no velocity without power, and there's no power without calories. And but also we can imagine this is, of course, I'm not a very strong believer in, I shouldn't say that it's wrong or that we won't learn more things about it. But again, I very often like to have a physics approach to things, not a physiological approach, but a physics approach. And the reason why I like to have a physics approach to it is because there are so many things in physiology still that we don't understand. So I'm always looking to find this input-output metric, like a global input metric, and then you have the global output metric. Global output metric is very simple, is velocity versus time, finito. That's in the end, the fastest athlete wins. So that's the true output of it. And then, of course, the global input metric, of course, on the one side, we could say that purely what's happening during a workout, if you don't ingest any carbohydrates or anything like this, is measuring the metabolic power. But again, also, we are talking about calories as well, but we also have to remember that there is a difference between calorie intake and calorie uptake. So and I think that's very important to understand, because there is a saying very often that to be in weight balance, you have to balance the calorie intake versus your calorie outtake. That's not the truth. The truth is actually to balance your calorie uptake versus your calorie outtake. But the problem is now that there's a parameter in between there, which is extremely complicated, and assists between calorie intake and calorie uptake. People take up new micronutrients different because of the microbiome and so on. And this is, of course, some of the crazy research that we are looking into now, sampling all the feces from the athletes and burning the feces in bomb calorimeters, and then also doing samples of the food and burning that in the calorimeters. It's not perfect, but it really is getting close to, let's say, understanding the whole chain from basically the potential calorie amount that is in a nutrient to basically where it comes out in velocity in the other end, both short term but also sustainably over long term. I think that what I don't believe too much in is that with all this ketone approach and all these kind of things, is that one way we could just try to extend it from an evolutionary perspective is ketone was so brilliant. Why wouldn't that be the preferred source during fight, flight, and not carbohydrates? That's a grossly oversimplification. But if you look at it from a purely physics perspective now, and we are looking for energy or ATPs that are being released from carbohydrate versus fats, for example, there are much more. Of course, ketones is a little bit that are much closer, of course. But the thing is that we have to remember there are two limitations there. Yes, there are more energy available, more calories available in 1 gram of fat than it is in 1 gram of carbohydrate. But it costs much less oxygen, or not much less, but it costs slightly less oxygen to burn or to convert a gram of carbs into ATP than it costs to do the same for a gram of fat. So even though there's more than double the energy density in a gram of fat versus a gram of carbohydrates, it still takes less than half the amount of oxygen to convert that gram of carbs into ATPs than it does for fats. And unfortunately, we can't choose between the two, because if we just had an abundance or infinitum amount of oxygen, sure, burn fat any day. But the problem is that this is exactly why the body also, with increasing intensity, gradually shifts more towards carbohydrates, because there is less and less oxygen available. So now the body has to do this more efficiently. And that's why I always like to come back to two fundamental laws of nature. And no matter how unique we think we are as humans, we are still subject to these fundamental laws. And one is the first law of thermodynamics, which basically is that you can't destroy energy, you can't create energy, you just convert one form of energy to another form of energy. So it means calories to velocity. And the other law is the stationary action principle, which basically means, or the law of least action, or the path of least resistance. And that means that basically anything in nature will try to find the easiest way to do a task with the least possible energy. So if you pour a glass of water down a hill, it will find the easiest path to run down the hill. And when you are running and just say, I'm going to run at this speed, so just figure it out in your body, the body will figure out the easiest way to do this in your body. And that means basically converting carbs to ATPs, because that's what costs the least energy. So I like very often, I don't say that we can't do it smarter, and that's of course always what we're trying to do with research, but it is hard to escape the fundamental laws of nature. It still has to be done.
Olav, that was a great conversation. I have just a few more short questions. They could be long questions, but I'm going to challenge you to give a short answer on them as succinctly as possible. First one is about warm-ups. What is your perspective on warm-ups, and how can we do them better?
I think warm-ups are important. Again, you can quantify it from a subjective perspective, but these we also have pretty good tools to measure also with everything from the MOXIE, which is brilliant to do this with. You can just look at, okay, what is your motor concentration before, what is it afterwards, and there you're looking to have like good high numbers when you're resting just after your warm-up. So you see that you're getting high numbers. That's a good indicator of a good warm-up for an athlete. And it also can give you an idea of basically how long time an athlete needs to warm up. Another way to do it is simply lactate. You will typically see that during rest that you have higher lactate values. A good warm-up would basically bring you to a rather low lactate value after the warm-up. It's not absolute, but it's an indicator. That's important to remember. Warm-up for me is basically bringing gradually in, where you allow an athlete to start out fairly easy, just getting in the movement. Nothing fancy. Just get moved in the specific modality that you are doing to do. So if you're going to do cycling, then start out easy. Just get on the bike and get in the movement. A couple of minutes, 6 minutes, for example. We normally keep them standardized around 20 minutes, but sometimes it can be 30 minutes. Sometimes it can be shorter than 20 minutes, but let's say 20 minutes. And then I think that we use our gradually increasing protocol, where we use the first 15 minutes just to start out very easy. Then we bring it up a little bit more towards where we know that something that costs a little bit, but still something you could have done for hours if that was the point. But now you're getting in a little bit more the specific loads and these kind of things. So warm-up has one goal for me. Nothing fancy. It has one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to prepare you for what you want to bring into the main set or the main focus of your workout. So I think it's always smart if you're going to do sprints, you're going to bring in small elements, but light small elements for this in your warm-up. If it's real to actually bring in small elements for this, so you basically prepare the body for it. Threshold, but even in light sessions, we very often see that, for example, when we have several sessions a day, that having a good warm-up, even on a light session, can be beneficial. So even there we bring it, but again, nothing fancy, but bring it gradually up, so the body, you allow the body to get ready for what you're going to do, and then in some small parts of specificity.
Another topic is tapering. What are the different parameters we need to think about when we need to taper an athlete for a specific competition? Duration of the taper, the shape of the intensity and volume distribution towards that competition. What do we need to think about? I don't need the exact answer, but what are the different factors we need to consider in a taper?
So this is of course highly individual, but starting with a sound approach is of course a good way to approach it. But this is individual, so that I think that when you are starting out with a taper, one have to be very open with the athletes and say, okay, this is best practice. So we go with this, and of course I think that the problem with a taper and this kind of period is that you are not doing that many races during a year. So you have to be patient. You have to be patient, and you might have to repeat something, even though maybe you had a poor feeling or a little bit off feeling, or you don't know whether it was because of the taper, because you don't want to make changes to something that you are not certain about that you want. So start out with the best practice, but then be open to that after you've done it a couple of times and you see there's a repeating pattern, you're trying to adjust it to the athlete, because I do know that there is individual differences, and they need to be taken into account to get the best out of an athlete into a race.
Last question for you, Olav. When we come to emulating champions, so what do we need to be careful in doing when we're looking at what you're doing, learning from your team, what do people that maybe not be at that same level, what do they need to be mindful of when it comes to trying to do the same as what you guys do? Where could the dangers be? And so what is good to emulate and what maybe needs to be approached with a bit more precaution when it comes to trying to do what the champions are doing?
So I think, again, that depends a little bit on what kind of level you are. So if you are, for example, just you are happy and your life is that you have a job and you are an age grouper, for example, it's very easy to try to say, okay, these are the best doing this, that's what I'm going to do as well. And already there, you're not considering, for example, everything from energy balance, because you also have to account the non-active, or let's say the non-training exercise time also into your balance. If you have a lot of stress there, that's also going to make an impact. So it's not you can just copy the volume or whatever that is for an athlete. So that's one. I think also the second part of it, of emulating it, is that I think that, let's say that now you're comparing apples by apples. So there's somebody that they are going in, they want to be the best in the world, and they are maybe in even the same races. So let's say it was an athlete that was racing the TCS races, fully dedicated athlete. Then I would say that I would, in the same way that I don't trust research blindly, I always want to reproduce it when I find something to basically see, does it fit in our context? I think there's the same thing here also. The way that we are approaching things, it's in a big context, and there are so many things we can't measure, there are many things we can't measure, and that's of course the part with the qualitative and quantitative part of it. I think that using, for example, if you're inspired by what we are doing, I think that's a good thing. Is use it as an inspiration, but make your own concept out of it, because of two things. One is that I think that you can get far by trying to copy somebody, but at some point I think that both psychologically and physiologically you have to believe in what you have is the best. And if you think that if what you are doing is basically only copying somebody else that is the best, I have a hard time thinking that you can think that you will be better. You have to have something or find your spice to it, basically, that you, and as a coach and as an athlete, really believe in that shit. We really found something smart here that we think can be our strength or something like this, and you're trying to leverage it. And that I think also is important. So listening to others, research what others are doing, like what we are doing and so on, that use it as an inspiration, but find your own spice and concept to it that you think will be the spearhead to beat the best in the domain.
That's fantastic advice and a great way to end the podcast. Olav, I want to thank you for coming on the show today, taking some time out of your busy day to make this happen. So yeah, thank you so much to you, man.
Thank you so much for the questions. It's been lovely speaking with you. I really like your questions and how you put it. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And well, I guess see you at the next race.
Perfect. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you would like to support the podcast, please take a few moments to leave a written review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. If you want to watch this episode again, you can find the full video recording on my YouTube channel. You'll also find hundreds of hours of free content, all my podcasts, my thoughts of the day, structured presentations, and more. So don't wait, go subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.